Hello and welcome everybody to the second series of leadership lessons brought to you by the Schulich Executive Education Center, or SEEK. We will be recording this conversation for those who are unable to attend today's live session or for those who want to relive today's live session. My name is Matthias Kipping. I'm a professor at Schulich and I'm trying to fill Alan Middleton's shoes as the host of these chats. Alan retired at the end of August, and I just want to acknowledge all Alan has done over the many years of service as the leader of SEEK. And I was very impressed when I watched the first series, how he managed these conversations. So as I said, these are very, very big shoes to fill. Our first guest in this second series is actually the same one who opened the first series, and that means he must have done a great job. Actually, he did a great job already in the first one. So we invited him again. It's Dr. Michael Gardam. I could list all his educational, professional achievements and his publications, but then the half hour we have would be over in no time. And Michael is so many things that I picked three that I think are the most important ones. So he is a world-renowned expert on infectious diseases. He is a leader of people in the healthcare sector, and he was until very recently chief of staff at Humber River Hospital. And third, he is a passionate educator and consultant, including here at SEEK, where he directs the Healthcare Leadership Development Program. What I only recently found out is that he also owns and spends time on a farm in Prince Edward County. But I won't talk about his farming experience. That's not why we're here. So I will use the other three roles to get him to elaborate on leadership lessons in the current context and beyond. We will bring in questions that you might have for each of these three roles and the three items we'll talk about. So please use the Q&A function to raise these questions, and I will feed them into the conversation as they come in. So let's start with your role as expert, Michael. Welcome, I'm very happy to have you. And let's start with your role as expert. So could you comment a little bit on the recent developments in the pandemic situation? Looks like almost everybody's in a second wave. Can you give us examples of good leadership, those who've done well, homegrown or foreign? There's no need, I want to take that off the table at the beginning, to bash our neighbors to the south. I'm really interested in good leadership. So Up to you. So let's hear about your recent assessment of what's going on.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a real pleasure for me to be here again. I think that, when I get asked who's doing a really good job, controlling things in the world, be it in schools, be it in the general community, I sort of smile a bit and say, well, whatever I answer you today will probably change a month from now, because what we've seen over time is countries that are lauded for, remarkable control measures. And a good example would be Israel, where they did a very good job early on at actually controlling COVID-19. Well, in the last few weeks, their cases have been going off the charts. A lot of it's related to school openings. They were also seen as a good example for school openings until they weren't. And so I don't think we're going to know until the end. When all of this is done, then we'll get a good sense of, who did well overall. Right now, if I had to give some names of countries that I think I've done well, obviously New Zealand has done well, but they have a huge advantage in being an island. Iceland has done very well. Germany has done very well. Of all of the European countries, Germany has pretty steadily been dealing with this quite well. Denmark was doing very well, but then recently their cases have gone up. And then of course we know about other countries in Europe, which had big outbreaks in the spring, calmed down, and now they're coming back again. So it really is all over the place. But one thing I will say, that things that stand out in countries that have done well, and this is obvious, clear communication from the leaders. The leadership needs to be open, transparent, honest with people. If they don't know what's going on, they need to say they don't know what's going on, but we'll find out. They are trusting in science. The countries that are doing well are trusting science, and they're listening to their scientists and their experts. Countries that are doing well are not engaging in wishful thinking. And there's a fair amount of wishful thinking going on out there right now, right? People thinking that this will be over in a few more months, or we'll have a vaccine by November 3rd, or whatever. Oh, that was an American reference. You know, whatever it is, there's a lot of wishful thinking going on, and it's actually not helpful. I understand leaders want to make people feel better, but you can't mislead them. Even if your intentions are good to try to calm them down and make them feel better, misleading and suggesting that maybe this will calm down by the fall or the winter just is not at all helpful. In terms of, you know, successful control measures, that's actually the easy part. We've learned over the last 6 months very well how to control this, right? Physical distancing, masking started out as something nobody wanted to do, and now it's pretty much become a universal strategy, and it's allow us to reopen things, not congregating in crowds, the concepts of bubbles, limiting the number of people you're in contact with, selective closures, selective reopenings, not closing too late, not reopening too early, lots of testing, lots of contact tracing. Those are the winning strategies. And so any country that has done well has done those things while communicating open and transparently. That's sort of the magic formula, I think.
Okay, and you named a few countries. Let's look at Canada. Is there any part of Canada standing out?
Yeah, so I mean, Canada's been fascinating because, like we always seem to be, we're kind of middle of the pack. We're not the best, we're not the worst. But as you know, Canada is very diverse, and certainly the strategies used in the Maritimes have been very successful. They formed a maritime bubble, but they also have the advantage that they don't have the same number of travelers, the same amount of interconnectivity with other parts of the world. So they do have some natural advantages, which they have used. British Columbia has been lauded many times. Dr. Bonnie Henry has been lauded as an excellent pandemic risk communicator. And she was one who was doing extremely well, again, until the last few weeks, when suddenly she's not as popular as she was, because the cases are starting to go up in British Columbia again. So, you know, if you're a hero in this pandemic, you're not a hero for long. And then we've got Ontario and Quebec, which are really driving most of the COVID numbers. And, you know, both of those provinces, it really is a tragedy what happened in long-term care and in retirement homes in the spring. That didn't need to happen. That was something we knew about. We saw that happening in Europe before it happened here. We've known about problems in long-term care for a long time, long before COVID-19, and we didn't jump on it. And to me, that is going to be one of the harshest lessons that's going to come out of this.
But we've learned that lesson. Now things are under more control. Is that?
Well, I mean, there's two parts to that, right? We definitely learned it. Whether we're going to let it happen again is another story. I am hoping we will not let it happen again. And I'm hoping that, you know, we also have not only a lot of experience, but like the spotlights of the world are kind of on us now. I mean, we had some of the worst outbreaks, some of the worst experience in long-term care as anywhere in the world. And for any government or any health system to allow that to happen a second time, I cannot imagine that is going to be the case. I think we will jump on it very quickly. And I truly hope that I'm right. I truly hope that this is not going to be another problem come this fall.
I just want to encourage everybody to ask questions if they have questions. So far, haven't seen any, but please do use the Q&A function to shoot Dr. Michael Gardam a question. And you said the end at some point, and you said that's not, you know, it's not going to end on November 3rd or any time in the fall or anytime soon. Is there? Yeah. What would you see as the, you know, end, if there ever is one?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at pandemics in history, right, and probably the most analogous one would be influenza. Typically, these are things that are occurring over a couple of years, to be honest with you, and usually they stop because you get enough herd immunity that things stop, or perhaps you develop a vaccine to it. You know, we still have a long way to go with this. I think I tweeted yesterday that if this is a marathon, we're at sort of the 14-kilometer mark. We still have a long way to go, because I mean, if you think about it, clearly things are heating up again. This is going to be happening over the entire winter. Perhaps we'll get some good phase 3 data being reported on the various vaccine trials that are being done. Maybe we'll hear that in November, December. Then they have to get approval. then they have to be manufactured, then we have to start giving them to people.
Hmm.
And that's not going to happen until the spring.
So there is no silver bullet, really.
There is no silver bullet. And I fully understand it must be enormous pressure on leaders to want to make this go away. As much as I don't agree with Donald Trump, I do understand at least his desire to make this want to go away. I want it to go away too. The problem is it's not. And so we have to be prepared to be into this for at least another year. And I would expect even longer than that, unless the vaccines come out earlier than expected and they work better than expected. That could really turn things around for us. But I'm not going to count those chickens until I actually see the data.
Until you see them, yeah. So I have two questions which are actually related from an anonymous attendee. Is are we in a second wave, and what does it take Ontario or Canada to get herd immunity?
Yeah, I mean, the second wave question's an interesting one because that's been bandied about everywhere, the second wave. And the concept of waves, by and large, comes from influenza. That's our experience every year. We have waves of influenza. During pandemics, you typically have more than one wave. And part of that is related to the characteristics of the virus itself. And so influenza thrives in colder conditions and in very dry conditions. And it's why all over the earth, wherever it's colder and drier, is when you get seasonality of influenza. There doesn't seem to be the same amount of impact of those things on the COVID-19 virus. Mm. I think the waves that we're seeing are entirely human created, right? We're seeing an increase in cases now because we've taken our foot off the gas, off the brake. If we put our foot back on the brake, it's gonna calm down again. We are doing this. Hmm. It's not the virus doing this. And so, in terms of, what this looks like, we are getting into trouble in Canada quite quickly. And it's very eerily similar to what was happening in early March. We're starting to see exponential growth in cases. It was only a couple weeks ago that Canada was reporting 100, 200 cases. Now we're 500, 600 cases. By the end of this month, we'll be well over 1,000 cases if we don't do something. And we haven't yet seen the impact of opening schools. We haven't seen the impact yet of opening universities. And we're heading into a season where more people are going to be meeting indoors. So I don't see anything positive about this fall. I see it becoming worse and worse. And it's not so much that we need to bring in new measures as we actually have to reinforce the measures that we have. And I think we do need to scale back some things that we've done, but not go back into a whole scale lockdown. That is not going to be helpful, I think, to anybody. But yesterday I was ranting in the media a lot about, we're just opening schools, but, strip clubs have been open for a while. We've had 2 outbreaks related to strip clubs here in the city. You can't even do contact tracing because nobody's giving their real names. That seems like an obvious industry that perhaps I'm not sure why it's still open right now, and where people are congregating, there's alcohol involved. That seems like an easy one for me.
Okay, I have now quite a few questions, and some of them are related to the second role that you've been playing as a leader in healthcare. And so, again, you've been a leader while the outbreak was going on at Humber River Hospital. You've also been yourself in healthcare because you had an out of the blue, I know you've been very open about this, out of the blue heart attack, despite being, fit and generally healthy. And then you were there during COVID as a patient. So, what do you see as great leadership in that context? What, have you got examples?
Yeah.
How do you motivate people on a day-to-day basis to do their job in this context? And then I have a couple of questions that I'll bring in.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question because it's, I was right there with my doctors at Humber throughout the entire first part of COVID-19. And I also work in other hospitals such as Women's College and Toronto Grace, and actually still at UHN as well. So I'm in a number of different hospitals. And I think the key thing, and this has been used a lot in the business literature, but people need to be seen, heard, and respected. They need to know that they're being listened to, that you've heard them, and you are respecting their concerns, and you're working with them to try to develop solutions. I think there's a tendency in emergencies like this to go very top down, right? Mm-hmm. now is not the time to hear about your concerns about this, or I don't want to hear that, you've got issues with this. We're in an emergency, just do it. And I would say that is not the approach to take. One of the things that I did at Humber was to really help our doctors get through, and the rest of our hospital staff as well, but predominantly doctors, get through the beginning of the pandemic by sitting down and listening to them, working through with them what they felt was going to make them safe, and then ensuring that I could push the boulders out of the way so they could actually get that. I think that really clear, transparent messaging and listening is the most important leadership lesson in all of this. And I've said previously that I perhaps would have thought that in a true emergency, you would not kind of go bottom up, you'd go top down. But in something like this, which is lasting so long, where you're asking your healthcare workers to put themselves at risk potentially, the top down doesn't work well. You really need to have honest conversations with people, and where things are unclear or you don't know, you say they're unclear and we don't know. I get it. Nobody likes ambiguity, but it is far better to communicate ambiguity than to pretend it doesn't exist. And so those would be the lessons that I learned. And then in terms of myself as a patient, I mean, one thing that struck me very clearly is, one of the things we did early on in COVID-19 is we blocked all visitors and caregivers from healthcare. So people were coming in on their own. We've all heard many stories of people dying alone in hospital, dying alone in long-term care. It's not clear to me in hindsight that we needed to be that aggressive. And one of the pieces of advice I've given going forward is we need to be much more careful about just shutting down the visitors. I mean, as a healthcare worker speaking, it often makes life a bit easier for us because then there's less people to worry about and deal with. But it is terrible for the patients to go through that, especially people in long-term care. There have to be ways that we can have some limited visitors at relatively low risk. We now have tests. We now know the infection control practices that work. We know exactly how to control this. So the hammer approach of just shutting everything down, I don't think we can get away with this time around. First time we didn't know, now we know better. I think we shouldn't do that again.
So there is actually a related question by Hilary Walker. She asked whether hospitals can normalize the situation, whether you can integrate COVID into the practices of a hospital. So you have a separate critical, ICU, and you have a separate COVID, and so on. Is that ongoing? Is that something that is being done or should be done?
Yeah, it is being done. And certainly the hospitals that I'm in these days, it feels, it's still odd. It's not normal, but it feels more normal than it did a few months ago. And honestly, what we've proven, and I can really speak to Ontario because I've been intimately involved in what's happened here in Ontario, and we did pretty well in the hospital sector, not so much long-term care again, which is a different story, but in hospitals, we actually showed that we could protect our healthcare workers quite well. We did have some outbreaks, but we showed we were able to actually control those outbreaks. We know what to do with this. This is not an unknown anymore. We know how to test. We know how to protect people, and so I think we are getting better at living with COVID. And certainly the plans going forward, even if things get really busy this fall, the plan is as much as possible not to shut things down again. Again, that made sense at the moment. We were terrified we were going to run out of ICU beds and you had to do what you had to do. But I think we're much more sophisticated now, and I think we've learned to live with it. And I don't see us going that route of just simply flicking a switch. The analogy I give is instead of an on-off switch, we should be using a dimmer switch.
Okay.
And can we slowly calm things down, but not just shut it off?
One of the problems is though that these infections only show up with quite a delay. I mean, compared to the flu, for example, that's a much faster process. Whereas here, the delay. So the second wave we are seeing now, a possible second wave, that's actually been caused 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks ago. Do you see what I mean? Until this manifests itself. Doesn't that make managing this a little more difficult?
It definitely does. Even with the schools opening, the universities opening, that's going to have an impact, but you don't know how much of an impact yet, right? And so that does make it much more challenging, which is, I guess, why we're trying to layer on multiple control measures at the same time, right? You can't put all your eggs in one basket. And so You know, we do offer asymptomatic testing here in Ontario, for example. We do have kind of universal PPE use. So even if we miss somebody, your healthcare worker is probably still quite well protected. We're trying to limit congregation. We're doing all of these blanket strategies as a way to, you know, cover ourselves because of that exact issue, as opposed to other diseases which might be much more easy to clinically diagnose, that are, you know, much more readily apparent, and it would be easier to be much more specific in your control measures. In this case, it's blanket control measures, but the world is showing that it works. It does work. You just have to do it.
Can we draw any lessons? This is called leadership lessons, from what's going on and what's worked in the healthcare sector to other organizations, to other, you know, parts of the economy, other parts, or is it so specific that?
No, I think it is very similar. I mean, I would argue that in any business, people are frightened. I mean, I've worked with a few businesses during COVID-19 and given them some advice on how they can keep their operations running and things like that. And the concerns people are bringing up are identical to the concerns our nurses are bringing up, right? How do I go to work and feel safe? How can I take the elevator to work? What happens when my kids go to school and there's an outbreak in the school? These are universal questions. And I think the idea of really thinking differently, so that it's not about shutting down or opening up, but rather, how do you live with it? And how do you keep your operation running while keeping people safe, while listening to them, and not spreading COVID-19? It is really a wicked question, but I think it's a very important one to wrap our heads around. And we've shown that we can do that. I mean, right now we're doing pretty well with that. We're not hearing about outbreaks occurring in businesses, except strip clubs. We're not hearing about outbreaks occurring in that kind of setting. We're hearing about social congregation as being a main source of our outbreaks. So I think we can kind of have it all. It's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be back to normal, but I think we can muddle through over the next year with the masking, with the physical distancing, listening to our staff, and not get into major trouble. I think it's doable. I think we've shown that.
But I mean, again, when you talk about these social congregations and that as the major source of new outbreaks, it's all about human behavior, isn't it? It's all about, you know, how each individual and we're social animals. We crave social contact. So is there anything we can do about that? And that also possibly explains some differences in the world, because, you know, other people behave more, you know, restrained and so on. If you go to most Asian countries, people will have always worn masks, or for many years and so on. So how do we deal with the human element of this?
I think that's a really vital point, and it's one that I've kind of worked with in my career over the years, which is what we tend to do when people don't do what we want them to do is we issue more guidelines, we put up more posters, we wag our finger at them, we, you know, give very stern messages, and we tell them they have to behave, etc. And they often don't. I mean, I've lived this my whole life working in hospitals, where asking people to wash their hands was the most difficult thing in the world. People didn't want to do that. Where the breakthrough comes from is when you stop nagging people and you take a step back and say, tell me why you can't do this, or why you don't want to do this, and actually start to have some empathy for the person you're trying to influence. There was a great string on Twitter this morning where around the world they've been asking 20 to 40-year-olds, why are you not playing ball? Why are you not doing what we're asking? And some of the answers back were quite sad in a way. They made the comment about, you know, we're social animals. We're already feeling alone in the world. I mean, that particular generation is pretty lost. And this has just made it so much worse. We have to be able to connect, you know, we have to be able to connect with people. Then, of course, there's the influence of social media, where if you want to look up, do masks work, you can find 100 websites that tell you they don't. Like, there's all of these factors that are playing in on this. And it's not just a matter that these people are being jerks. Some of them are, but many of them are not. And I think putting ourselves in their shoes, empathizing with them, and really trying to have conversations with them is the way to go. It takes longer, it's more painful, and it seems so much easier to just wag our finger at people, but that doesn't work. Anybody who was teenagers know that that doesn't work. But if you start to have conversations with them, you may start to understand what's really going on.
And that already takes us into your other role as educator, as consultant. So if you once the dust settles, and like you said, it won't settle in one swoop and it will be over. But once we get a clearer head, and once we're out of the midst of this, what should we do? What are the big lessons, and what's necessary to avoid this going forward, even bigger waves of this, or a new pathogen that comes along, because we know from history that these microbes will always be there, and this has happened. We just tend to forget most of the time because we don't want bad memories. Yeah,
there's that lovely quote of, one thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history, right? And I think that rather than focusing on more the infectious diseases technical side of things, right? There's all these warning systems and things that the world has or used to have and quit funding. I mean, we're very good at having an event, putting lots of money into it, and 10 years later, you forget it ever happened. I mean, the greatest example in Canada would be the so-called pandemic stockpile that we were supposed to have that we ended up not having. And that was a key learning from SARS. We should have had our own domestic supplier of PPE. We should have our own domestic supplier for vaccines for exactly the reasons that we're seeing today, yet we didn't do it. To me, I think it's the building in of the fact that, as you said, these things are actually fairly predictable. They come quite frequently. And this is the first time I think the really modern world has experienced something like this. And so you hope some of the lessons are going to be sticky. For me, one of the leadership lessons is feeling comfortable making decisions before you have all the information. We've seen that in Canada, and I feel it right now here in Ontario and in other parts of the country. It feels like things are getting out of control, but I'm not getting enough communication from the leadership out there to tell me exactly what's going on. If we're waiting, why are we waiting? Explain it to me, be transparent to me, and feeling comfortable with the fact we don't have all the information, but we're going to make a call now. Because if you make a call early, you can have minor tweaks which will pay off dividends down the road versus waiting and then getting into serious trouble. Our experience in March, my opinion is that we acted about a week or two too late. And I feel like we're doing that again.
But at the same time, you have to understand, because you don't want to overdo it again, and you don't want to.
I know.
So there's this balancing act that a good, but you said transparency is very crucial, no? To say, hey, why are we doing what we're doing?
That's exactly right. And I think that's why you have to invite in those divergent opinions. You actually have to intentionally talk to people who don't agree with you, because I also find in emergencies, we tend to congregate with people who are like us. And you need to, every time you want to shut something down, you need somebody with an economic lens telling you this is a disaster for us, right? Every time you want to open up, you need people from the infectious disease community going, that's crazy. What are you doing? I mean, I'm not suggesting for a second it's easy to be a leader, but you've got to bring all these divergent opinions in, figure out what your values are, figure out what your overarching goals are, and then make decisions based on those. And I find that here in Canada anyway, we've tended to be, and I think it fits we're a very conservative country, and we're not risk takers. We're not really entrepreneurs. And this kind of thing where you have to make decisions quickly on the fly when you don't have information is not necessarily Canada's strong suit. But I think we need to learn some of that. We need to learn to be a little bit less risk averse, and a little bit more willing to act before we have all the information in front of us.
But at the same time, as you said, listening to both sides and then weighing the benefits. And I think that's the a true leader is, because if that wasn't the case, we could let the machines make decisions for us.
That's right.
Somebody has to weigh the pros and cons and listening to everybody.
And that's very counterintuitive in an emergency, because somebody will say, well, if there's an earthquake, are you going to set up a focus group and chat and talk about, what's your opinion? our tendency when things get scary is to shut it down and just drive it through. And I guess what I'm advocating for is there's no doubt there needs to be some of that. You can't dilly-dally forever, but by the same token, you have to invite in these divergent opinions. I mean, we all know in business, diversity is good. There's no downside to getting diverse opinions, diverse people, diverse backgrounds in the room. It helps you plot a much more nuanced course forward. And I guess that's what I'm advocating for.
Thank you, Michael. That's a great way to end it. We're actually run out of time. I'm, great start again to the, I know there were more questions, and thank you again. And I'm passing now on to Associate Director Robert Lynn from SEEK to tell us who our next great speakers are. And thank you again, Michael. This has been very insightful. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Robert.
Thank you, Matthias. And thank you to everyone for attending today's session. Please feel free to join us at our next fireside chat, Leadership Lessons from Indigenous Businesses. That's on Thursday, September 24th at 1 p.m. Our speaker is JP Gladue, who is the former president and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Special thanks today for Dr. Gardam for joining us. Please have a great afternoon, everyone. Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Great.